Now to help us break down the developments, we have Professor Kim Jae-chun from Sogang University here with us today. Thank you for coming on the show, Professor.
It's good to be here.
So, as we've just heard, Pompeo told reporters that North Korea Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho restated their commitment to fully denuclearize, but at the same time reissued a statement warning that North Korea will not act first unless the U.S. shows it's taking further actions to build trust. What do you make of these two contrasting statements, and what should we listen to?
Well, as you said earlier, I think the tug of war is taking place between the two countries with regard to who will have to take the first step. I believe that North Korean regime certainly thinks that they have lived up to their part of the big bargain after the June 12th summit by demolishing Punggye nuclear testing sites and also shutting down testing sites for ICBM and also returning remains of the war dead to the United States. But the U.S. certainly thinks that these measures aren't really good enough because these measures don't really address core issues of denuclearization. So the U.S. position is that you will really have to take meaningful steps toward denuclearization. Unless those happens, the U.S. is not willing to de-escalate sanctions, and the U.S. is certainly not willing to declare an end to the Korean War. So there is a tug of war taking place with regard to who will have to take the first step, who will have to be listened to first. I don't know. I mean, there's something that two countries will have to work on. Maybe Moon Jae-in government will have to play a more of a proactive diplomatic role here to mediate the differences between the two countries.
Yes, play a broker, essentially. The report just now also mentions a possible second summit between Kim and Trump before the end of the year. We don't know the source of these comments. They cite North Korean officials, but we don't really know at the moment. But do you think it really could happen?
I mean, if you don't know the source of these comments, it's all guesswork right now. I think North Korean Chairman Kim Jong-un is more than eager to hold the second summit because it's going to be a huge political victory on the part of North Korean regime. Mr. Trump might be tempted to hold the second summit if he believes that holding the second summit with Chairman Kim will work to his political advantage, but without making a real progress toward denuclearization of North Korea, holding the second summit will become a huge political burden on the part of Mr. Trump. So I think it all depends on whether two countries will be making a real progress toward North Korea's denuclearization.
I think it's pretty clear what the U.S. wants from North Korea. Positive steps towards dismantling its nuclear program. But from North Korea, they talk about further actions to build trust. What do you think those actions are? What are we looking at? What does the U.S. need to give North Korea at this point?
Well, North Korea, the regime certainly wants the U.S. to take a more of a proactive role here in declaring an end to the Korean War and to de-escalate the sanctions. Those are gestures of goodwill toward North Korea. So North Korea is adamant about not taking the first step toward denuclearization, such as presenting a report of existing nuclear arsenal and materials and facilities. So if the U.S. takes the first step here and to declare an end to the Korean War and to de-escalate some portion of the sanctions, that will be taken as a gesture of a goodwill toward North Korea, and that might actually jumpstart North Korean action towards real action toward denuclearization, but we're not so sure about that yet.
You mentioned the sanctions there. I mean, since the ASEAN Regional Forum over the weekend, North Korean state media has been quite adamant and quite vocal about their criticisms of the sanctions, and they've asked for them to be lifted. What do you make of North Korea's aggressive tone, and does it not risk antagonizing the U.S. here at this point?
Well, it certainly does take a risk of antagonizing the United States, but if you give in too much when your good gesture is not reciprocated by the U.S., by U.S. Taking a first action to declare an end to Korean War and then de-escalate some portion of the sanctions, the North Korean public might think actually that, well, North Korean regime is giving in too much to the Trump administration. I think that can be one of the reasons why the North Korean regime is adamant about not really taking the first step here.
What's interesting also about North Korea's criticisms since the ASEAN Regional Forum was, in one of the the state media news pieces, while criticizing the U.S. administration, it also revealed for the first time that Pyongyang had returned the remains of the U.S. soldiers killed in the Korean War. Now, do you think this was a deliberate act by North Korea to release this kind of information on the news media? Because it hadn't done so far.
I think it's a way of putting pressure on the Trump administration. We have done our share of work here. I mean, since early this year, North Korea has taken great pains to improve economic situations by opening up to the United States. To that extent, North Korean regime went as far as to return remains of the war dead to the United States without any compensations. So, but the economic situations aren't really improving in North Korea. So, by releasing this information to North Korean public, you have an excuse here. We have lived up to our part of a bargain here, but the U.S. isn't really following up here. So it's all U.S. faults. So it's a way of putting pressure on the United States and blaming the U.S. For the economic conditions that aren't really improving since early this year.
So despite the return of the remains and other steps forward, right now it seems that the two sides, the U.S. and North Korea, are deadlocked at the moment. They're not making much progress. Which side do you think is more frustrated right now?
I think both sides are frustrated, but I think it's North Korea which is under more of a pressure because, as I said earlier, economic situations aren't really improving, and there is a sign that the U.S. is trying really hard to strengthen the existing sanctions regime against North Korea, in which case North Korean economy might turn for the wars, take the turn for the wars. So sure, U.S. is also under the pressure. I think President Trump and Trump administration is also under immense pressure from the news media and public opinion that is very critical of the Trump administration's handling of North Korean nuclear weapon situation. But all in all, if you think about economic conditions that are deteriorating in North Korea, I think North Korea is under more of a pressure here as long as we maintain these sanctions regime intact.
What's interesting right now is the Trump administration has also reimposed sanctions on Iran. Now, the situation with Iran and North Korea related to the U.S. aren't exactly the same, but they do have some parallels. What message do you think the reimposing sanctions on Iran sends to North Korea?
I don't think Trump administration is intentionally reimposing sanctions on North Korea to impart a certain message to North Korea. I mean, when the Trump administration decided to pull out of JCPOA, which is Iranian nuclear deal, everybody pretty much expected that the sanctions would return after 90 days. So I don't think reimposing sanctions on Iranian regime is to impart a certain message to North Korea. But that said, yes, the Trump administration can certainly say to the North Korean regime that we are very much eager to willing to hold on to sanctions regime unless you take the first step. So. Yeah, I don't think there was the intention was to impart a message to North Korean regime, but there is a message that the North Korean regime can glean, lesson that North Korean regime can glean from Trump administration's decision to reimpose the sanction on Iran. As long as you don't take action, we have no intention of lifting sanctions first.
I know, but for North Korean point of view, it's very much like, how can we trust the U.S. when they've said they've made a deal, but they suddenly put out of it? With, to be honest, not a lot of changes in the situation.
Exactly, but yes, so there is, as you said, there is a parallel between the two cases, but I think Iran and North Korean cases are fundamentally different because in case of Iran, there was a legitimate deal that was cut like 5 years ago, and then the Trump administration backed away from this legitimate deal. But in case of North Korea, there was no such a deal. And it was possible for North Korea to walk out voluntarily to denuclearization negotiation table because there was an agreement between the international community as a whole, all these countries, that North Korea is going too much with these nuclear weapons programs and missiles. So there was agreement shared, a consensus shared by the international community that we will have to impose sanctions on North Korea to bring North Korea to the denuclearization talks. So there is a big difference between these two cases.
Again, the timing of the sanctions on Iran is quite interesting as well, because we heard that North Korea's Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho from Singapore was scheduled to go straight to Iran afterwards. Why do you think why the North Korea's Foreign Minister would now go to Iran at this point? I mean,
well,
is it just coincidence?
To put some pressure on the Trump administration, we might actually reinstore some of the cooperation programs that they used to have with the Iranian government years ago. But I don't think this tactic will turn out to be effective. I don't think Iran and North Korea will be able to present a unified front against the United States. I don't think it's going to be able to elicit a consensus or support from the international community. So it's a way of sending a message to the United States that we can restore some of the cooperation programs between the two countries, but I don't think this is going to be effective, and I don't think Trump administration will be scaling down sanctions because of the North Korean foreign minister's visit to Iran.
So I think there's still some message there, I feel like, that they're playing almost
yeah, I mean, at least there is something that we can do between
Yeah.
the two countries. So, yeah.
So from one diplomatic trip to another, South Korea's nuclear envoy went to China on Monday, and they are said to have met, well, he's said to have met his Chinese counterpart to talk about the declaration to end the Korean War. It seems like China is getting more and more involved in this process now. What do you make of that?
Well, I think China's position is very clear with regard to this progress of declaring an official end to the Korean War, because they were a party to the ceasefire agreement after the Korean War. So they are saying that it is quite natural for China to be a part of this process of declaring a formal end to the Korean War. But deep down, I think their intention is to maintain or initiatives in Korean Peninsula affairs that have taken place. Maybe trying to prevent growing influence of the U.S. In North Korea. So yeah, as you said, I think it is very clear that the intention of China government is to to get more deeply involved in Korean Peninsula affairs so that they can maintain these policy initiatives in the Korean Peninsula affairs.
What do you make of the fact that, though, South Korea is making so much effort to try and get China involved in this as well? Because although China was one of the signatories of the ceasefire, essentially it's between the two Koreas and possibly North Korea and the U.S. Why do you think South Korea wants China involved so much as well?
Well, initially, Moon Jae-in government was not really eager to get China involved in this process of declaring a formal end to the Korean War. Moon Jae-in government first initially thought that it can be done without China's participation, between the U.S., North Korea, and South Korea. But China made it very clear that they are a power to be reckoned with here in Korean Peninsula affairs, and putting a lot of pressure on South Korean government here. And I think South Korean government grew more realistic that the sidelining China at this moment is counterproductive here. And one of the fears is that China isn't really enthusiastic about speeding up North Korean nuclear denuclearization process here. So if you get China involved in this process, maybe the process of denuclearization and the process of building a peace regime on the Korean Peninsula might be delayed. I think that is the reason why the U.S. and the South Korean government a little bit wary about growing influence of China and China's willingness to participate in this process of denuclearization and then peace-building regime on the Korean Peninsula.
Interesting, but I'm afraid we're out of time, Professor. But thank you for coming in and sharing your thoughts with us today.
It was my pleasure. Yeah.